Hi, this is Paul. Some of you might have wondered where the Heidelberg Catechism series went. Well, it sort of got stuck. And it got stuck because, I was using this series as some prep for some new members at Living Stones. That was going fine. If I had been doing this series just in a physical room here at Living Stones with the 4 or 5 people, 6 people in the room with me, that would have been fine, because when you talk to a room of a few people, everybody's got their stories, everything is sort of told in private, and you can just have a real conversation. When you're doing something like I'm doing with the Heidelberg Catechism on YouTube, almost anything is a controversy, and anything is going to be debated. Now, I take that as a given, and it doesn't bother me. But there are certain areas that are a lot more sensitive, pastorally sensitive, and that's part of the reason that I paused. And I paused because I wanted to feel ready to approach Lord's Day 7, question and answer 20, and give it the attention it deserves pastorally. Now, as I said, almost every article in the Heidelberg Catechism can be debated and will be debated in a place like YouTube that is full of what I call Christian YouTube. Christian YouTube generally has all of the different persuasions and traditions and positions of Christianity and beyond Christianity represented, and people are mostly sort of selling and policing. They're trying to promote a particular perspective, and they are calling out or denouncing people who have different perspectives than they are. And there's a lot of concern trolling, and that's sort of the posture of not just Christian YouTube, but religious YouTube. And I have never really wanted to participate in that because I think it's actually pastorally insensitive. And so where I could discuss and just basically talk about a bunch of different things confessionally on YouTube and not have a problem, just because I know people are going to differ and fight, and I'll try to state my ideas and my thoughts and my convictions and teach the thoughts and doctrine of the church as clearly as I can and as honestly as I can. Pastorally, when something gets fraught like this, I pause, because it's one thing to have people disagree. It's another thing to really cause crises in people's lives. So, Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 7, question and answer 20 says this: Are all people then saved through Christ, just as they were lost through Adam? Answer: no. Only those are saved who through true faith are grafted into Christ and accept all his benefits. Now, the difficulty in something like this is that there are many words here in this really fairly tiny little statement, question and answer, that hide a complexity that many people never visit. The words, they just have certain assumptions that tend to be shallow and low resolution, and then you state something like this and the shouting begins. And I know that shouting will be in the comment section. Now, I release these on my YouTube channel, and I release them in some other places as well. And part of the reason I release them in different places is, people want to have that fight in the comments on my YouTube channel, on my personal YouTube channel, go right ahead. I'm absolutely fine for that. And part of why this little corner of the internet, this little community that has sort of developed, to whatever degree I have influence in that corner, I would like us to have good conversations about these things, not just typical YouTube religion conversations. And that's part of the reason I conduct myself the way I do on YouTube. And I know I have critics both inside and outside, let's say, the Reformed faith. I'm a Christian Reformed minister. So, but I do what I do for the reasons that I have. So there's so much that you could talk about in this question and answer that in numerous videos I couldn't exhaust it. but I do have to do some treatment of it, and I have to begin with this video because this one that I begin with is perhaps it needs to be done before any of the other videos happen. So the issues here are deeply complex. They're deeply historical in the West. This is the majority position of Latin Christendom. So I'm a Christian Reformed minister. The Christian Reformed Church is a Protestant denomination. Protestantism comes out of Roman Catholicism and is deeply shaped by Augustine, and we'll get to Augustine in a little bit. And so this is what is expressed here is predominantly the position of the Roman Catholic Church and many Protestant churches downstream of the Roman Catholic Church. That is its legacy and the legacy of the language. But there are immediate consequences pastorally that have continued to change and morph over the years. And 300, 400, 500 years ago in Latin Christendom, whether Protestant or Catholic, many people would agree with this. Now, they might disagree whether or not the Catholic or other Protestant churches are, in fact, grafted into Christ. But what this statement says, they would agree with. We live in an age of religious pluralism. And we are surrounded by people that we love that participate or don't participate in various different religious traditions. And what a lot of this gets boiled down to is heaven and hell. Now, I have stated, maybe not enough times on my channel, but many times in church, the Bible is not primarily the story of heaven and hell. A lot of people look at the Bible as a set of rules, and how you stand or comply with those set of rules will sort of make this world a sorting mechanism for whether you go to heaven or whether you go to hell. And whether or not people have thought deeply about that or think about that carefully, that is an assumption beneath almost everyone in the West, who are many people in the West who think about or look at Christianity. I hear it. I just recently did a little bit of commentary on a conversation between Alex O'Connor, one of the sharpest and most interesting young skeptics out there on YouTube, and I'm having trouble with the Catholic nomenclature. I'll just use Father Gregory Pine, who they did a little conversation. And what I heard from Alex O'Connor, who is very well educated and very smart and very articulate, he represents Christianity as this grand sorting mechanism by which people go to heaven or hell. And that's sort of the low resolution take on it. And the reason he does that is it's a low resolution take on what Christianity is, even for many Christians and even for many churches and church leaders. So that has to be addressed. And that makes this issue and this statement deeply conflicted, even though if I were doing a class on the Heidelberg Catechism, depending on the mix of people in that class, and just read this statement, a lot of people wouldn't find it to be controversial at all. We wouldn't have to talk about it hardly at all. But in a broad public space that is highly conflicted, we have to talk about it. And this has only gotten more difficult in the last couple of hundred years with ideas about human ancestry and how the first few chapters of the book of Genesis should be read. Is Adam a historical figure, an archetypal figure, a symbolic figure, a mythological figure? All of those issues. I'm definitely not going to address those issues in this video. I don't know if I'll get around to addressing those issues at all. But so this is, and then how then that figures into lostness and then salvation and what we mean by that word. Again, I have lots of videos on YouTube, and you can go through my Romans class if you want hours and hours and hours of some of this stuff. But I'm going to condense it into something a little bit more manageable for this. Now, recently, just in fact yesterday, some of the people in the corner, these are friends of mine that are sort of working in the same YouTube space. Luke Thompson has been trying to lead a conversation on what is often called universalism. And again, even all of this language is so reductionistic and shorthandish that so often when I watch people talk about this, and this is one of those issues that in our little corner of the internet is a near perpetual conversation, I often have to sort of ask people to, well, tell me exactly what you mean by universalism. And then other terms come up like infernalism or eternal conscious torment, terms that I've never heard until a year or two ago. But you can see that in many ways, these theological convictions and assertions are continuing to morph and evolve and change as the internet develops and as YouTube starts batting these things around and as people start processing. This is all very much a living theological tradition, and stuff is moving. And now they had here Jordan Daniel Wood, the guy in the lower right-hand corner, is a very legitimate scholar, Roman Catholic background. Wrote a significant book on Maximus the Confessor. Luke Thompson, a very important member of our corner, does live streams very often, has had his own spiritual migration. He's a layman. They're all laymen. In fact, most of the people in the corner are lay persons, not ordained. But this is a very big deal for Luke. Luke, for a while, spent his time in a conservative, young, restless, and reformed congregation, and now is worshiping with the Orthodox. Nate Heil, founder of Grail Country, friend of mine. He was the one who did the Pacific Northwestuary conference that I was at a little while ago. Tremendous conference, just a tremendous conference. Nate, very well read, very smart, very articulate, worships with Anglicans and is sort of a Christian anarchist, if you can figure out what that means. And so this is a live topic. And I'm really glad we can talk about it, because I think actually this issue is one of the big issues in our time beneath the surface of many churches in the West. I think that there are almost always issues beneath the surface in churches in the West that are not getting processed because people can't talk about them. And they can't talk about them because there are confessional commitments. People have an understanding that that if you start talking about these topics carelessly, people are going to get angry, hurt, relationships are going to be stressed. A lot of damage can be done. And so we're sort of in the middle of having something we should talk about, but something we can't talk about. And those are often some of the most important things to talk about, but it's really difficult to talk about them well. And when I mean talk about them well, I mean actually be able to make progress, to have people feel like they're making progress in understanding, in learning, but also not just in clarifying their own ideas, but in terms of building community and loving one another. A new commandment I give you, Jesus says, that you love one another. That's way up at the top for Christians. Love one another. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. So if you're going to have these conversations, you need to figure out how to do them in love. And when it comes to a conversation like this, it's extremely difficult because so much is at stake for so many people given our religious history and tradition. And I'm going to play here a little bit of that conversation where Nate tells us why he doesn't believe in hell. And I think Nate's story is typical of many people's feelings about this and many people's positions about this. And I think many people in church that don't want to say or admit this, but functionally this is their experience. And it's just like Nate. So I'm going to drop that clip right in here. Now, Christians who believe in hell in a certain way often take the additional step of assuming or consigning individuals to it. I think this is actually a violation of taking the Lord's name in vain. God alone has the authority and permission to pass judgment at this level. And so, even though we'll all have thoughts about things, we'll all have opinions, I think we ought to be very careful about declaring such and such a person, so and so, is lost or in hell. Now, that doesn't stop people. And I often find that people are tremendously inconsistent on this. I'll find people who, I don't believe in hell. This could never happen. Well, what about Hitler? Yeah, he's definitely there. Okay. And that kind of inconsistency is normal with human beings. And that should be a tell in terms of what we're doing with language, what we're doing with opinions, what we're doing with ideas. And that very much should function here and is why people should be very careful with this kind of language. Now, part of being a universalist is that, in a sense, you don't have to be careful. It's sort of easier to say, well, I don't believe in any of this. But then sometimes if I start digging around in their assumptions, well, then suddenly it gets a lot more complicated. Now, historically, some churches have done so categorically. Before Vatican II, there's no salvation outside of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, what does that mean? Protestant denominations have done similar things. Theological traditions have done similar things. And fair enough, the Christian Reformed Church, people in the Christian Reformed Church have done similar things. I'm sure of it. I remember in seminary, Fred Closter, who was my seminary professor of systematics when I first went to seminary. He, very conservative man. And, I sort of took my clues from him. He said, on one hand, and this is how I work pastorally, I just made a video about Dog Bark's death. And I use Dog Bark as an illustration because he's known here at Living Stones and he's known out on the internet because of his participation with the Freddie and Paul show. And I play his music sometimes on my channel. I have no problem talking about Dog Bark's salvation. I have no problem giving the family assurance that Dog Bark is with the Lord that he loves. There are other funerals that I do that do not have that. And someone who's listened carefully might say, well, you're not talking about this person the way you're talking about that person. I'll say, no, that's right. Because I feel assured about something, but I'm not going to pass judgment. Because it's not my place to judge. I don't know. I don't know enough about the other person. I don't know enough about whole ranges of things to pass judgment. That was Fred Closter's position at Calvin Seminary when I went there. Very conservative theologian in the 20th century. And I think it's a good position. I think many Christians take that position, that we can celebrate those that we have confidence are sharing, are grafted into Christ and all his benefits, as the Catechism says, and have sort of a posture of agnosticism and hope towards those that we don't have that assurance of. It doesn't mean they're condemned. It doesn't mean anything. It just means, I don't know. It's a perfectly valid thing to say. Some churches have had that position. I think increasingly more and more churches, at least in the West, and I think, again, reading Miroslav Volf's Exclusion and Embrace. I read that book a number of years ago. I should probably read it again. Miroslav Volf goes through these issues quite deeply in that book, wrestling with the question of perdition. And how does this work? And does it make sense? It's interesting. Of course, the Church of Rome has been the largest church in the world, has been very expressive on this issue over the years. But Jordan Daniel Wood, who is one of the participants in this, is very vocal in his embrace of universalism. So that we're sort of used to that from Catholics. No offense to the Catholics out there, but you've got a lot of people, which means that a lot of Catholics share a lot of opinions, a lot of them disagreeing. But that's the way that is. I won't get into your business, but I think it is important to note that Jordan Daniel Wood identifies as a Roman Catholic and participates in that conversation the way he does. And I'll put a link to the whole conversation in the notes here. But if you love people, you should be careful with this issue because it's people. And Jordan Daniel Wood actually says that in the video. I don't know if it made the clip or not. You have your beliefs, which may or may not line up with those of your church or tradition. I get that. You owe to your neighbor a little bit of sensitivity about your presumptions with respect to their loved ones. And so sometimes silence is a very important thing. Now, how conflicted is this issue historically? In a book on Romans...
Actually, I want to address that because I want to explain why I've never believed in a hell of the kind that infernalists advocate. Obviously, as we've talked about earlier here, I do believe in hell in some sense, but it's in a different sense. Now, the reason I never believed it is because I was told when I was very young that my grandfather, who was the person I most loved in the whole world, and who I really enjoyed spending time with. My parents, when I was young, were like, they were like standard, like they're kind of like evangelical Christians who like came out of the Jesus movement in the late 60s and the early 70s. And they told me that my grandfather, who was the best man I knew, would go to hell because he did not believe in the way that they thought one had to believe in order to be, quote, saved, unquote. And I knew the whole thing was bullshit from that moment. Like, that's just like, oh, okay. Obviously, everything you guys believe is complete horse shit if you actually think that. Because I had enough moral intuition to know that my grandfather, who I loved, was a very good man. And any God that would choose to send to eternal perdition a person who I knew and loved and knew to be good was not a God that I could ever get behind. But I never didn't believe in God in some sense. I just didn't believe in that God. And so it took a long time for me to realize that the God I believed in, even then, when I was 5 years old, is actually the God that is revealed in the Bible.
When I was doing my Sunday school class on Romans, I used this book because I love questions of the history of interpretation. I love questions of the history of interpretation partly because cultures impact interpretation significantly. And part of the reason that I think questions about the doctrine of hell are so hot today is because, well, I think Miroslav Volf touches on that well in his book Exclusion and Embrace. People who live in a war-torn place usually don't have any problem imagining hell. People who live lives of affluence and security tend to drift towards universalism, but not always. So I found this chart that's on the screen in this book, and I think it's a really helpful one. 4 views of eternal salvation and punishment. Universal salvation, or universalism. Origin, ancient, very important church father. J.W. Collinsoe, I don't know who that is. Schleiermacher, important figure in the development of modern liberalism. And again, so there's some of that. There's reasons why people have the theological positions that they have. J.A.T. Robinson, another person, if I call correctly, a modernist. A fairly recent modernist Robinson is. Universal salvation. the idea of eternal punishment for sin or eternal perdition. And language is super important in this conversation. Just seems not in keeping with their picture of who God is. And most of the arguments in that live stream that Luke did were of that nature. And those are the common arguments of that nature, and they're powerful arguments. Reverent agnosticism, not exactly sure what he means by that, but it seems that people basically say, hey, we don't know. Clement of Alexandria. I mean, Clement was so early. He was just the next generation after the apostolic generation. Really important church father. Reverent agnosticism. Maximus the Confessor. At least this is what Reasoner places him. I don't know what Jordan Daniel Wood would say about that, who wrote a significant book about Maximus the Confessor. Reverent agnosticism. Karl Barth. Hugely important theologian in the Reformed Protestant tradition on the continent in the 20th century. Reverent agnosticism. Hans Urs von Balthasar, significant Roman Catholic theologian of the 20th century. Reverent agnosticism. Richard John Neuhaus, Lutheran, then Catholic theologian, very important in terms of the 20th century, late 20th century in North America. Same position. Annihilation of unrepentant. Arnobius, don't know who he is, didn't look him up in the book beforehand, but John Stott. Significant evangelical leader, hugely influential in American evangelicalism and British evangelicalism. Annihilationist. So, and then eternal punishment of unrepentant. Augustine, Martin Luther, John Calvin. So this is why, especially in the West, Augustine deeply influenced Latin Christendom. And of course, Protestantism is downstream from that. And so Augustine, Luther, and Calvin sort of stake out the majority position of churches in the West. And eternal punishment of unrepentant. So throughout the history of the church, major theologians and church fathers have wrestled with these questions, and there's not been a consensus. To the best of my knowledge, and Sam might argue about Origen, and maybe Clement, but probably from silence in Clement's part, all of these individuals, Trinitarians. I don't know, was Schleiermacher Trinitarian? But in other words, huge consensus among many of these theologians on many things, but not this issue. That is an important point in this issue, that this is an element of the church that we continue to have very living theological debates on. And as I said, I don't think our cultures and our cultural contexts are uninvolved in these. And so that should help us show a little patience with each other and a little bit of deference towards each other as we talk about these issues. If you look at something like, let's say, the Apostles' Creed, there's very little in the Apostles' Creed about it. He will come to judge the living and the dead. He descended into hell or Hades. So this is an area, and of course, a lot of the debate will then rest on the Bible. And for me, I mean, it's the Bible that sort of keeps me in the Western Latin fold for the most part. Although I have great appreciation for reverent agnostics and you know, in some ways, aspirations for the universalists. I don't believe it, but I think many who believe in perdition are hopeful that maybe we're wrong. Maybe we're reading the Bible wrong. There are some passages in the New Testament that are seem deeply universalistic. And so this is part of the reason that the debate continues. And there are many complex issues nested in these questions that most people simply read. I hate when I have it wrong. Most people simply reduce by inescapable narratives. The imagery is just so vivid. The stakes are just so high. Our ability to project suffering and feel the heat of it is so intense. Our love for individuals, as Nate said, so important that it's a hot issue. And it's a big arguing point for skeptical apologists. Because the culture is rather shallow on this topic, this is a big piece why people, as very much Nate really hit all the points. I couldn't believe in a God who would do this. And so for apologists, it sounds so anti-democratic to have people walking around imagining that their neighbors are going to suffer eternal conscious torment. And so apologists, this is a main point they usually bring up. I can't believe because I can't take this. They say, well, would you be a universalist Christian? No, I can't do that for other reasons. Okay. Given all the influences in our decisions, how can God judge us for actions and beliefs? It's a very common one. What about people apart from Christ historically, through no fault of their own? These questions come up all the time. Is it fair to punish eternally for temporal transgressions? These are just super common talking points that get raised, and they're legitimate concerns behind them. Now, Lord's Day 7, question answer 20. The narrative is from the book of Romans that you find embedded here in the question and answer. And Adam, as our legal head, all are lost. What do we mean by lost? Are all people saved through Christ just as they were lost through Adam? No. Only those are saved who through true faith are grafted into Christ and accept all his benefits. Now, there was a Christian Reformed minister who wrote some books towards the end of his career declaring something, what he called biblical universalism. And they're very interesting books. And basically, what he noted is that people walk around with an assumption that all are condemned except for those that are specifically declared to be saved. And he sort of flipped it and said, what if everyone who is saved, basically leaning on certain passages that lean universalistic in the Bible, what if all are saved except for those who are explicitly said to be condemned? And it was a neat trick, and I found his books to be interesting. For the most part, most were unpersuaded, although I thought it's at least enough of an idea that it's worth mentioning. What his idea nicely illustrates, however, is that so many people just react to this so quickly that if you just pause and take another step of analysis and ask the question a different way, then people will say, well, and they'll begin to discover all of the assumptions that have been packed into their reaction. And part of this develops in religious traditions and communities because communities find themselves unwittingly formed into reactivity about different things. And people who like to argue, skeptics and Christian apologists, make use of those reactivities that are built into us in order to win points and be convincing and so on and so forth. It's just a part of how rhetoric and a certain amount of wisdom and knowledge works in the world. The work of Christ addresses the rebellion of Adam and Eve. Eve isn't mentioned here. The rebellion of Adam and Eve, and achieves salvation. And again, one of the things that I've done for a long time is people would throw out that word saved or salvation, and I would just pause them and say, what do you mean by that? And then they sort of take a step back because they're, well, pastor, you of all people should know what that means. Yeah, I know a lot of the dictionary definitions, but what I want to know is what you mean by that. And the reason I do it is usually to get them to pause and hopefully to dig a little bit deeper and to maybe explore a little bit what that word means, because it's a word with a very broad lexical range in the English language, and it tends to be used often for certain specific things, but those things are just sort of going under the radar, and there's a lot of those little landmines that promote reactivity under those things. So I usually like to pause people on that word and say, think more carefully about that word because it's an important word. What is salvation? To whom is it applied? And of course, this world and or the next, because that's important. And when Nate says his grandfather was the best man he ever knew, that's not unimportant in this conversation, as Nate instinctively knew. But that experience of that reactivity then went on to form Nate in a particular way. Now, I want to say a few things about the book of Romans, because the book of Romans is sort of central here. Mark Reasoner wrote this book, if I recall correctly, because his father once noted to him that if you look at the book of Romans and you isolate a few passages in it, you find these forks in the Christian tradition that seem to go out of this. And so then he wrote what I think is a very interesting book, and not a very large book, basically noting significant church fathers and theologians and the forks that they took on interpreting certain select passages in the book of Romans and how that forked the Christian tree in some interesting ways. It's a very interesting book. And I think a really helpful book to understanding, we've been having these conversations for a very long time, and a lot of the issues that might be new to us are not necessarily new to the church. And just the ideas off the top of my head, well, there might be something to learn by reading people in past generations. And I think it's really helpful for Protestants and Catholics who tend to get hung up over this question of sola scriptura, that history of interpretation is a real thing. And either the tradition of the church or interpretation of the Bible, it's a very living thing. And it's helpful to remember that. It's probably, the book of Romans is possibly the most important undisputed letter of Paul of Tarsus in terms of trying to apply Jesus of Nazareth to the broader Roman world. And I did a lot of study on the book of Romans in my adult Sunday school class before we moved to Estuary on Sunday morning. Now, the book of Romans, it begins with a question of the pagan world apart from God, the God of Israel's revelation to his people. Roman 1 talks about the lostness beyond Israel and the presence of God via general revelation. Romans 2 talks about the lostness in Israel, that despite the revelation given to her, Israel still went astray. And then Romans 3 sort of puts them all together and says all have fallen short of the glory of God and are subject to God's wrath in particular ways. But that then, when you get to this question of lost, then we're getting to this word wrath. And again, Miroslav Volf basically has noted that, well, a lot of people who live in the affluent, comfortable West find the idea of God's wrath to be antithetical. God is an ever-present source of cheek turning and looking the other way, and there's no wrath in God at all. You look at the history of interpretation and theology, very much not a majority take in terms of Christian civilization. So the wrath of God is very difficult, and this will often come up when there's some natural disaster. And Tim Keller's book on suffering, I think, is helpful, and he notes that the problem of evil has been around a long time. This is one that, again, is often brought up by skeptical apologists. But it takes a turn in the modern era. And I don't think that's unimportant either, particularly with the destruction of Lisbon by an earthquake, fire, and tsunami on a Sunday when many people were in church. And we visit this regularly when there's a tornado that goes through the south, and it seems that tornadoes sort of wind a circuitous route, and sometimes it'll miss a church, and everybody say, see? God's hand was upon it. Or sometimes it'll hit a church, and people say, see, The church should be condemned, or tornadoes have nothing to do with the will of God. Tornadoes are just subject to weather patterns, and weather patterns are products of chaos. We're not really chaos, but cause and effect. And so very quickly, if you follow this train, you get into a lot of other interesting conversations about, well, what is the nature of God? And whether or not a tornado hits a church, what does it have to do with salvation? And just recently, of course, there was a hurricane that went through a very Christian area of North Carolina, and Jordan Hall was there, and we've had conversations about that. And we can't not think about this. Now, a lot of this gets into this thing that I've been working on since fairly early in my video career, thing that confuses many people, but I find it a helpful way of at least thinking about it. Maybe it isn't as helpful as talking about it, because it's sort of continued to develop as I've talked about it, of God number one and God number two. And if you look at my Romans course, I talked about God number one and God number two and law number one and law number two. And whereas I don't really have tight definitions of any of these things, I do sort of have working models of usually tensions and dualities that are sort of pushing against each other and paradoxes. So what do we mean by God? Now, one definition, sort of like God number one, is God is everything and everywhere. Sort of, not really. The Apostle Paul says in the book of Acts, in him we live and move and have our being, on a sermon on Mars Hill. Downstream of Ezekiel Kaufman, God is arenic. God is like an arena. And Ezekiel Kaufman wrote, interestingly, how the God of the Bible is different from the pagan conception of the world, where pagans seem to have something called a meta-divine realm in which gods as actors and agents worked, but the meta-divine realm had rule and laws, and I think that meta-divine realm in the history of modernity sort of then became kind of a deism, and then kind of, in the minds of many, God as arena was sort of lost. And part of what happened in, I think, the early Jordan Peterson days is Jordan Peterson quite effectively reintroduced God as arena, which began to provoke, I think, the conversion of a lot of people, because when it comes, and interest in the Bible, because when it comes to the Bible, I don't think you can really understand the Bible without understanding God as arena as well as God as agent. But most of the skeptical apologists frame God as agent, and then in this agency, well, now he's sort of easy to blame for evil and suffering, because surely this agent would do something. Nathan Jacobs had a video on a film on Amazon about the deconstruction of and the rise of the nuns, NONES, people who have no religious conviction. I remember one woman talking about her uncle who, like Nate Heil, was a very good man. And he died because he was smoking in bed, and the cigarette fell from his lips, and the mattress caught on fire. And the question is, why didn't God save him? And so God would be the sort who would swoop in and move the cigarette, or send in an angel or something like that. And so in some ways, her question about the hiddenness of God and the nearness of God, or the presence of God, or the agency of God, had to do with the loss of her uncle. And I think in some ways that's parallel to Nate's story about the loss of his grandfather and the assignation of his grandfather to eternal condemnation. Now, pantheism sort of has God as everything. And what has happened in at least contemporary Western culture, at least Californian culture, where I see people have the nuns have sort of moved away from God, because God is very agentic, and now sort of talk to the universe. But they talk to the universe almost as an agent. And it's very interesting watching this development. It's like you can sort of feel bad about the characters in the story, and so walk away from an organized religion. But then suddenly you sneak back in, and your religion still has a lot of the same features it used to have. You just call it by different names. And sort of had Verizon Lisa on early videos where it was a Verizon commercial from I know 2015, 2016, I had remembered it because I saw it on TV and I thought, oh, that's interesting, because she's walking by a cell phone store and the universe is telling me to get a new phone. Oh, so the universe talks. You had this in the movie Avatar, where supposedly God is just a pantheistic God, but then that God sort of takes on agency. And so actually, the agent arena relationship, as John Vervaeke talks about, there's a little bit of fluidity between them too. Because arenas do sort of have agency, and agents can be very arenic. Let's say a parent in a household who has rules. They're very much an agent, but they sort of become an arena through rules and other institutions and other things like that. So I've always said that the Christian God is God number one and God number two. He's agent and arena. God of general revelation, that's sort of God number one, and special revelation, sort of God number two. God number two is a personal God, an agent, someone who acts, wills, judges. And usually what happens in these kinds of conversations is we sort of mentally slip between them very easily. You know, let's say, if I drop something heavy on my foot and blame God, well, which God should I blame? God number two for not intervening, or God number one for gravity? And so when people sort of say there is no God, there's a certain God they sort of keep. But they don't hold that God responsible for anything, because that God is sort of much more expressed in laws rather than in actions that are personally targeted. And as I've been listening to the very interesting conversations around Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and many other skeptics out there, I listen very carefully for these categories, especially when they get into questions about ultimate existence. Because for Christians, God is the source of all existence. God is ultimate existence. Some people have used terms like the ground of all being. But again, these are all metaphors, because really the truth is our minds are too small to adequately comprehend that in which we live. So the wrath of God, and so when a hurricane strikes or something like that, often you'll very quickly find Christians wading in and saying, God did not do this, and the God that did not do this is very much God number two. But you find others saying, well, that doesn't sort of leave him off the hook because God didn't stop it. But then God number one is still sort of out there and in the background. And if you read the Bible carefully, there's something called the divine passive in the Bible. And I just pulled up ChatGPT, who has led me astray before, but this is description, but I thought it wasn't too bad. The divine passive is a grammatical and theological concept in Scripture where a verb is used in the passive voice, implying that God is the implied agent behind the action, even though God is not explicitly mentioned. This stylistic feature is common in biblical texts, especially in the New Testament, and reflects I find it a lot in the Old Testament, frankly, and reflects a reverent way of speaking about God's actions without directly naming him. And I think this sort of gets into the number one and number two-ness too. And Christians have had lots of ways of trying to talk about, God allowed this to happen, God intended this to happen, and sort of all that number one and number two-ness sort of gets flowed into those conversations. And I think what that recognizes is that this is just really dicey things to talk about. C.S. Lewis talks about that as well, in terms of God's action isn't quite the same thing as our action. But truth be told, if you press our language hard enough on our actions, things get squirrely for us too. In the book of Genesis, for example, after Joseph's brothers treat him absolutely horrendously, and then when he has the upper hand, are in terror that he is going to exact vengeance on them for first threatening his life, beating him up, and then selling him as a slave to a whole amount of suffering. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So where is God's agency in the action of Joseph's brothers? John Calvin really gets into this in his commentary on the book of Genesis when he's talking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, or Jacob wrestling with God. And John Calvin says basically with one hand he upholds Jacob because Jacob could, with his left hand he upholds Jacob because Jacob could never fight without the strength of God, and on the other hand he fights against him. So with his left hand he fights against him, with his right hand he upholds. I'd have to look up the text, but you get the idea that very quickly this is a complex way of talking, and these kinds of complexities are all right there when it comes to questions of why do we do what we do? What are the cultural conditions? What really is going on in the world that brings us into this world and brings us to the decisions and actions and beliefs that we have? So it isn't just about the wrath of God. So again, as I said, when a hurricane goes through or a tornado goes through or there's huge loss of life and it's a natural disaster, well, in my take, well, number one, there's a degree of human culpability that's traditionally been in Christianity in terms of to what degree is the world fallen because of Adam's rebellion. And I've always talked about the fact that there's sort of a hierarchy. There's God and there's humanity as viceroy, as agent in the world on God's behalf, and then there's the natural world. And when we rebel against God, nature rebels against us. And I think Paul talks about that in Romans 8. But that, again, is tremendously contested after sort of deism and then current ideas about what nature is, and very much in terms of the laws of physics and natural order. And it's part of the reason why I like C.S. Lewis's book on miracles quite a bit. There's an issue that people often don't talk about, even universalists, because most universalists, I find, don't believe that Pol Pot, after he shuffled off this mortal coil, was sitting on puffy pillows, eating grapes, and having 40 virgins to pleasure himself with. Very few people think that. And even universalists, many universalists sort of, if I listen to them carefully, they usually don't explain themselves very well. Most universalist talk is basically now that the terms have been created, no eternal conscious torment, no eternal conscious torment. Okay, well, what is there? A lot, I think, in the Western tradition just find purgatory of various lengths for all. And then there are some edge cases like Satan or Judas that tend to get brought up, and that tends to be how the debates unfold. But one of the issues that usually arises is, hey, wait a minute, what about justice? What about judgment? Because it's not just Christianity. You can find it in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You can find it all over the world in many religions. The afterlife is a place where the balances of justice for what happens in this world are set right. And this is one of the things against that Miroslav Volf in Exclusion and Embrace noted, that when under communist rule, ideas about the afterlife vanished, now suddenly all the score settling had to be done by us in this dispensation, which tended to accentuate and increase the bloodshed, because here's a fact about human beings: we're lousy judges. We get a lot wrong. And even when we think we have all the facts, our judgments are biased. And this is part of the reason that historically, and not just within Christianity, God or the gods are the judges, because humans are bad at this. And we recognize this. We get a lot of stuff wrong. So actually, some form of punishment and judgment in the afterlife is critical to systems of justice. And I tend to find universalists don't talk enough about this, because it's sort of easy to get out of hell free if you just say there isn't any. Okay, but how much suffering are people going to have to endure in either that justice requires or that somehow remediation demands in terms of them getting fit to be good citizens in an agentic afterlife? These are hard questions. So eternal perdition and punishment is most easily imagined for humans' worst actors. I told an AI image engine to make me images of tyrannical dictators, and it's so interesting. So upper left sort of looks like Hitler, and then upper right sort of looks like Mao. Look at all the red. Lower left sort of, it's Stalin-ish, even if it doesn't look like him. And then you've got one of the North Korean dictators in the lower right. So AI search engines and image engines, they use our images, and so this is sort of archetypal images. How does God address the fact that Hitler, Mao, and Stalin pretty much got away with it? Is there no afterlife? Is there no God of judgment? Is there no punishment in the afterlife? None? Zero? I find that both difficult to believe in terms of my own fallible judgments, but I also don't find it terribly. I find that the Bible has a very vivid imagination about suffering in the afterlife. Now, exactly how this is going to be dealt with, fair enough. Good conversation. How much can we know? Most cultures in the world have believed that justice in this world requires a post-death judgment in the next. And I find this to frankly be an area of difficulty for atheists. Because Hitler, Stalin, and Mao got away with it. What does that say? What does that encourage? I think it's a big deal. The main point of this video is God will get it right. A good God will do what's right regardless of our opinions and disagreements. Humans are bad judges, so our judgments about this are fallible. He will come to judge the living and the dead, the Apostles' Creed says, and I think that is right. God will judge the living and the dead. All of us get judged, and according to the Bible, according to what we have done. Now, then the theological complexity begins to go to work at it, and so on and so forth, and Protestants versus Catholics on questions like purgatory. C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, is very interesting, and of course, Lewis was a disciple of George MacDonald, who Lewis actually put in the book, but I don't know that Lewis was the kind of universalist that George MacDonald was, because it seemed like darkness was going to fall on the gray city. So was Lewis an annihilationist? Lewis doesn't get into it. And I think Lewis doesn't get into it partly because Lewis understood, I'm not sure to what degree we can answer a lot of these questions. We have to go on what we find in Scripture, and doing the theology of this is not easy, as, again, those major theological camps have recognized. But pastorally, the main point is God will get it right. And so when people come to me, and let's say, like in the case of Dog Bark, I knew the man's heart, I knew the man's soul. You can find him talking with Pine Creek Doug on his channel, where he labels himself a 4-point or a 5-point Arminian. Was never a member of Living Stones, but was interested. I didn't know if he would stay long enough for that, but I have no question in my mind Dog Bark trusted Jesus. No question in my mind. Now, sometimes people come to me and tell me stories of loved ones and say, what do you think about them? My first question is, I am not their judge. My second answer is, let me tell you about the judge. The judge of heaven and earth. For God so loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Well, what if they didn't believe in him specifically? Well, the same God who sent his Son is still the judge, and he will do what's right. And the details of that I cannot say, but the confidence I have is in the character of God, which I'm not different from those guys arguing about, arguing that universalism is true because of the character of God. We seem to say we see the same character of God, but we might see other questions about well, what about this? And what about, and it seems strange to have, I mean, Jordan Daniel Wood sounded like a good Calvinist in some ways there, but a Calvinist universalist, which probably was sort of what George MacDonald became. So, but these are difficult questions. But the thing about the Christian God is, he is that good. Because the image of the invisible God, a la Colossians 1, is Christ. Now, again, Christ could be direct. Depart from me, I never knew you. Whitewashed tombs. Christ was no, he also said turn the other cheek. So there you have, as Tim Keller, I've used it often in sermons that I won't bring it up, Tim Keller riffs on Jonathan Edwards of these incongruous excellencies in Christ. We don't know how, on one hand, he can be the stern judge we find in the book of Revelation. On the other hand, he's the one who welcomes the sinful woman who washes his feet and dries them with her hair. We can't fit these ideas together, and I think that is a big piece of this debate. That God is both a sterner judge than we dare face, and so incredibly forgiving than we dare imagine responsible. And it's the same God. And that is the judge. So, if you're anxious about the goodness of someone that in certain frameworks, like Nate Heil said, in certain frameworks you have reason to believe that despite all of the questions in the world, God's grace seemed to shine through them. I think those are good things to point out. God is right and good and generous. And so when someone comes to me and I know their Christian faith like dog bark, I will say, I fully anticipate sitting with him at the banquet of the Lamb. I don't have any questions about that. What about this person? Well, I might not be able to say that, okay? But I know the judge. And yes, and I know how one who would not withhold his own son, that's the judge. Others would come to me and say, this person that died, they did horrible things to me. They abused me. They mistreated me. They caused untold suffering in life, and they got away with it. And you look at genocidal dictators, they got away with it on a massive scale. My God is a God of judgment. Jesus will come to judge the living and the dead. So fear not, judgment will also prevail. Well, how can mercy and judgment meet? There's the Christian story. How this will play out, I don't know how it plays out now in the world. And all of those factors are involved in now. People who on one hand are universalists can get angry and condemn and turn away and shun and fight, and this is how we are. So, yeah. Is it hard to put together? Yes. Does that mean I can put it together perfectly? No. Is it illegitimate to have any of those four positions on the page? No. The church has been talking about this. Can you have, is yours correct? Possibly all of us are fallible, but have positions. That's the way human judgment goes. Trust God more than your ability to demand a system or game a system. That's key. Because that's what you should do. Trust him. Trust the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these things is built all the law. Most of us aren't arguing about that. We accept that. This has to flow from that. Now, an illustration of that is a parent of a 2-year-old child. 2-year-old child is full of judgment. They are sure about everything in the world. Just recently, during the winter break, I pulled up some old video of my kids when they were little, and my daughter's a 2-year-old, and she was the He's just the cutest 2-year-old, this moppy head full of blondness and big blue eyes and a few teeth. And this one video, it was probably, I had just come home from work, and so it was 5, 6, and it's sort of the witching hour for 2-year-olds, because at one moment they're ecstatically happy, and then they're crushed, and then they're fighting with their sibling, and that's how we are. And God looks. The image that Jesus gives us of God is our Heavenly Father. And Jesus says, if we ask for an egg, will he give us a scorpion? No. If we ask for a fish, will he give us a snake? No. So this is our God, and that's the main point. God will get it right on both the justice side and the mercy side. What if PVK is wrong on this point? If God isn't God enough to get this right in every case, then we've got far larger problems, and the rest of the conversation is a waste of time. The conversation is an attempt to understand, but none of us have the power to game any system with God, just like a 2-year-old is not going to game a parent. It's primarily a pastoral conversation, which is why it's easy to default into denying any eternal perdition. That's just sort of you can sort of punt your way out of it. Now, I'm not saying that all universalists are punting, but it's sort of easy to say that until you land in the judgment thing. And this, I think, is part of what's behind Miroslav Volf's point that, the universalists, not always, look at Origen, universalists, our picture of God is calibrated by our experience of the world. And so people are going to have theologies, people are going to have positions. And none of those positions mean love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, figuring out what love looks like, never easy. But in this issue, that's true too. Now, there's difficulties of nomenclature and understanding. It's relatively easy to deny something. It's far harder than to make a positive case for it. And I think I often see that in this debate, that it's easy to deny hell. Okay, well, you tell me about the afterlife. You tell me how justice will be served. Yeah, but eternal justice for temporal transgressions? Okay, what do we mean by that word eternal? Well, is eternal just a long time? To what degree can any of us who have only known temporality really wade in on eternity? There's a lot of fast and looseness that goes on in the reactive debates around this stuff. Our understanding of salvation in the age to come is just as murky. We have these evocative images, streets of gold. No giving in marriage. We'll be like the angels. Gosh, what on earth does he mean? Peter Kraft has a great little talk that you can find in MP3 when he talks about sex in heaven. And he says, the reason I don't want to talk about sex in heaven is it makes me think more about sex on earth. So, yeah, there's a lot we don't know. So a little bit of humility will go a long ways. But that doesn't mean that churches and traditions don't have to do this work of trying to talk about and defend and participate in confessional conversations and what we believe. It's all part of it. Have I fleshed all of Lord's Day 7 out in this video? No, by no means. And maybe I'll make another one, Lord willing. But I think this is what I have to say when I talk about this question and answer. Because what I tend to find is it triggers, I'm just waiting for certain commenters to just tee off in the comment section on this. And, okay, this won't stop that. I get it. But I wanted to make the pastoral point first. That love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the big rock. It goes in the bucket first. Our thoughts about how this all works out, it's not unimportant. There's theological work to do because our pastoral moves are built on our theological tradition. But pastoral sensibilities have to be taken into account when delivering theological beliefs. Because everyone we're dealing with are image bearers. And so they deserve that respect. So we'll see. For reasons at Living Stones, I can adjust this process of going through the Heidelberg Catechism. But part of the reason I had to stop here and pause was I had to make this video first. And I had to feel ready to make this video. And actually, by God's providence, it was, I think, Luke's provocation in the corner of putting forward this live stream and putting out the universalist arguments that thought, okay, well, maybe now I've got some good illustration. And then when Nate told that story, and again, Nate is someone who in this corner, I feel comfortable sharing that story on my channel and to my church. And because that's sort of what we have in the corner is sort of a commons license amongst us, that we're talking about these things publicly and we understand. And this is for, in my opinion, it's for the kingdom. It's for the kingdom of God. And if we can model how to talk about this, well, maybe we can bless the rest of the church and the rest of the world. But this one is a big deal. And so we have to be careful how we talk. It doesn't mean don't talk. It just means we have to figure out how to talk. And before I talk about the issues in this was what I needed to say. And so if I do subsequent videos, I know people will, and I'll have to keep pointing back to this video, before you comment on the details here, pay attention to what I said there, because that's the big deal. All right, so leave a comment. I know you will.